From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. This first Sunday after Christmas, we get to read one of the more beloved chapters of Holy Scripture, which is the prologue to the fourth gospel. It functions, for the musicians in the room, like an overture, in that it tells the whole story. In just a few sentences of beautiful poetry, it captures what all the rest of the gospel will be about. I love this poem. And if you quit listening to me for the next few minutes and just read the gospel over and over again, I will not mind, and it will be a really good use of your next 6 or 7 minutes. Or maybe this prologue, this poem, is a song. In fact, it's probably a song. The various books of the New Testament include quite a few song lyrics. Paul quotes from songs or hymns or spiritual songs that the early church sang. It's almost certain that Mary's song, the one called Magnificat, My Soul Magnifies the Lord, is one that was sung by followers of Jesus long before the gospel was written. And so it is with this one. I think it's a song because it's one of those things that tries to describe a beauty that is so transcendent, so wonderful, that you can't get at it with words alone, no matter how eloquent you try to make them. So you try to add tune or movement or something else. The beginning of John's Gospel deliberately echoes the beginning. In a different famous and familiar song, the ancient Hebrew poets sang the song of creation. In the beginning, they sang, in the beginning, God. God's voice roars out over the formless void. Let there be light. And there was light. And following the light were all the other things. And God filled them with blessing and wonder and delight. Do you remember the repeated refrain to the song in Genesis? And God said, let there be this. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let there be this and the other thing and creepy crawly beasts and God saw that it was good. And God created humankind in God's own image. And behold, God looked at everything that God had made, and God said, it is very good. When starting to tell the transcendently beautiful story of Jesus, John's community, the community of the beloved disciple, started it in the same way. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, God spoke. And the word that God speaks is God. And the word that God speaks, just like in the first story, is light. And the light shines in the darkness. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. I used to have a friend who was a high-level aircraft mechanic for Boeing. This is back when I used to design airports for a living, and I got to meet some wonderfully strange people. Anyway, one time when we both had a day off, he invited me over to his workplace, to his hangar, where they had a 777 in. Now this is before 9/11. You probably can't do this kind of thing nowadays. This was a long time ago. But because I was with him, they let me into the maintenance place. And I just got to crawl all over the thing. And he showed me how it all worked. You can stand upright in one of those twin engines. It's that big. And I got to go up underneath the cockpit in this tiny little crawl space and get literally nose to nose with the banks of electronics that flew this aircraft. At the time, the 777 or the 777 was a brand new aircraft. I know it's 20 years old now, but I had a buddy from church at the time who was a pilot for United, and he said he loved flying the thing. And it was there was a relatively new thing about the 777 in that there were no purely mechanical connections between the cockpit controls and the wings or the flaps or the engines. It was all, I think the phrase was fly-by-wire that they used back then. But there was no, I mean, you moved the stick and there was no physical connection between the stick and the rudder. All electronic. And while that made it a great plane to fly, and while that experience was fascinating for me, the nerd, to get to, there were some people that I told that story to who were kind of wigged out by it. They didn't want to know, because there are some things that to know too intimately can be alarming, When you're sitting on a run, and I know it's COVID and we haven't gone anywhere in a long time, but when you're sitting on a runway and you hear the pilot say over the intercom, okay, we're cleared for takeoff, then there are people who don't want to know, to paraphrase the 1998 movie Armageddon, that you're sitting on 40,000 gallons of jet fuel and approximately 270,000 interchangeable parts, and the computer is doing some of the flying. You really don't want to get that close to the story because it robs it of its magic. Well, I tell you that story because Christmas is one of those times when we are invited to step into the guts of the plane, if you will, to stand inside the engine, to get really up close, nose to what makes the story go, what makes the gospel what it is. When we accept the invitation to come in through the door of the stable, we are invited to see who God really is and how God works. And the song that John sings to us this morning tells us that the creator of all things is somehow stuffed into this tiny, shivering bundle of flesh. That God has given himself away so completely, so utterly, that where we find him is in poverty and weakness. Christmas tells us that this is what God is like. God acts by giving away all of God's strength, all of the power, all of the success as we define it. Success for God is the manger and the cross. From the beginning of time, says John, God is pouring out his own self in the person of the Word. And the Word, having received everything by the gift of the Father, gives life to all creation. And now the Word makes the gift of himself, becoming human for our sake. And John says, from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace upon grace upon grace. The whole universe exists because God has not held back his love, but allowed it to flow. And our lives as his children, as the Galatians reading tells us, are empowered not by following some set of rules or ethics or following some set of beliefs, but by the knowledge that God has given us something of his own life. And it's that pattern that we follow when we pour out our own lives and we try to multiply God's blessings in the world. Okay, remember that thought you were holding. This year's journey to the manger has gone through some dark places in the world around us. The light shines in the darkness. And maybe it's the dark times like these that we need to hear this message more than ever. The good news, the gospel news, the news that gets us up in the morning is that God has entered the world in a tiny town in a backwater province of an empire to an unwed teenager. And put that way, you might wonder how it could possibly matter. But right there is the promise of the gospel that God shows up in places that we least expect God to be. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Or depending on your translation, the darkness has not comprehended it. It doesn't mean the darkness has been obliterated. That's not how God works. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. And our response, our life as Christians, flows from the knowledge that God has given us something of his own life, and that our truest form of living is that when we do the same, we pour ourselves out with the kind of love that blesses the world, that shines the light of God in the darkness of and around our lives, the kind of love that makes other people more alive. That, says God, that is the engine that drives the world. Thanks be to God.